Mark woke up in the middle of the night with his heart pounding as if someone had called his name in a dream. The knocking at the front door came fast and desperate, shaking the quiet house like a warning. He glanced at the bedside clock and whispered, 2 in the morning? Who knocks at this hour? Lena slept peacefully beside him, unaware of the growing tension. Mark slipped out of bed, grabbed his jacket, and stepped into the hallway where the wooden floor creaked under his feet. As the knocking grew weaker, he pressed his ear to the door and whispered, "Hello? Who's out there?" But no one answered him. Instead, he heard only soft breathing mixed with the cold night wind. He finally opened the door a small crack and froze when he saw the person standing outside. It was Grace, his younger sister, shivering under the porch light with her clothes wrinkled and her face full of fear. "Grace? What happened to you?" Mark asked, rushing her inside before she collapsed. She shook uncontrollably, holding her arms as if trying to keep herself from falling apart. Lena woke up from the noise and hurried out, whispering, "Mark, who is it?" before noticing Grace on the sofa. Without asking more, Lena grabbed a warm blanket and tea while Mark turned the heater to its highest setting. When Grace finally calmed a little, Mark sat beside her and spoke gently, "Talk to me, Grace. Tell me what's going on." She wiped her eyes and whispered, "I couldn't stay in that house anymore. Ethan, he keeps controlling everything I do." Mark exchanged a worried look with Lena as Grace continued in a shaky voice. "He tells me where I can go, who I can talk to, and how I should dress. I thought the marriage would get better, but it only became worse." Her voice cracked as she added, "Tonight he crossed a line, and I ran. I didn't know where else to go but here." Mark tried to stay calm, though his hands were shaking with anger. "Grace, you shouldn't be living like this. You need to leave that marriage," he said firmly. But the moment she heard the word leave, she sat up straight and grabbed his wrist in fear. "No, Mark, please don't say that. You don't understand what he can do," she whispered with wide eyes. Lena sat on the other side of her and rubbed her back gently, saying, "You're safe here. No one will hurt you." But Grace shook her head quickly and whispered, "You don't know Ethan. If I leave him, the consequences will be worse than anything you can imagine." She took a long breath and began speaking as if unlocking a secret she had hidden for years. "He keeps threatening me, Mark. He says he'll take my child away if I ever try to leave or report him." Mark felt the room freeze as he listened. Grace continued, "He told me he has connections, money, and people who will ruin my name if I speak up. He keeps reminding me that his family can change any story to make him look innocent." She wiped her tears again and whispered, "I live with that fear every single day." Mark clenched his fists quietly as Lena whispered, "No one deserves to live like that, Grace." Mark stood up and paced across the living room, trying to control the anger rising inside him like boiling water. "Grace, this isn't right. You can't stay trapped because of his threats," he said, struggling to keep his voice steady. But Grace shook her head slowly and whispered, "You still don't understand what he can do to me." She looked at the heater's glow as if afraid someone might appear from the shadows. "He once hurt someone before he met me, and his family made the whole thing disappear," she added with trembling hands. Mark stopped pacing and stared at her, stunned by the weight of her words. Grace continued speaking in a low voice, as though she feared Ethan might hear her even from miles away. "He told me that his parents can make evidence vanish, stories twist, and people stay silent," she whispered. Lena sat closer and said softly, "Grace, no one can protect him forever if the truth comes out." But Grace shook her head again and covered her face. "They can destroy any woman who speaks against them," she said with a trembling whisper. Mark knelt in front of her and replied, "Not if we stand with you, Grace. You're not alone anymore." The rest of the night passed slowly as the heater hummed and the house remained wrapped in heavy silence. Grace leaned back on the sofa and murmured, "I should have noticed the signs earlier, but I kept hoping he would change." Lena held her hand gently and whispered, "Many women hope the same, Grace. It doesn't make you weak." Mark sat on the edge of the coffee table and said, "You came here because you trusted us, and that was the bravest thing you could have done." Grace looked at both of them with tired eyes as tears rolled silently. "I just want to protect my child," she whispered again, holding her hands close to her heart. By morning, the house was quiet again, and a soft light filtered through the curtains, painting the living room in pale gold. Mark walked into the room expecting to find Grace asleep, but the blanket on the sofa was neatly folded. His heart tightened as he whispered, "Grace, only to be met with silence. He grabbed his phone quickly and called her, hoping she was still nearby. When she answered, her voice sounded calm but forced as she said, "I'm home now, Mark. Everything is fine." Mark frowned deeply and replied, "Grace, let me pick you up. You shouldn't be there." But she only forced a small laugh and said, "I'm okay. Please don't worry," before ending the call. Mark sat at the dining table staring at his phone, the cold coffee untouched beside him as worry grew heavier in his chest. He knew something was wrong, something Grace wasn't saying out loud. After thinking for a long moment, he stood up suddenly and whispered, "I can't stay silent about this." He grabbed his car keys, drove straight to his parents' home, and prayed they would help him protect Grace. When he arrived, his father Tom opened the door with surprised eyes and asked, "Mark, why are you here so early?" His mother Mary appeared behind him, wiping her hands on her apron as she asked, "Son, what's wrong? You look shaken." Mark stepped inside and said, "I need to talk to both of you right now." Mark sat with his parents at the kitchen table and told them everything that had happened the night before. He explained how Grace arrived at his house in fear and how Ethan had been hurting her for months. Tom listened quietly, rubbing his forehead as if trying to process the shock. Mary covered her mouth with both hands and whispered, "My poor daughter, why didn't she tell us?" Mark leaned forward and said, "Because she was scared, Mom. She needs us now more than ever." But as soon as he mentioned reporting Ethan, both parents exchanged a worried look. Tom shook his head slowly and said, "Mark, don't get yourself into trouble with that family. They have money and connections that we don't." Mary squeezed her husband's arm nervously and added, "We've seen what people like them can do if they feel threatened." Mark stared at them in disbelief as he whispered, "So you want her to stay quiet and keep suffering?" Tom sighed deeply and replied, "We want her safe, son. Sometimes silence is the only way to stay alive." Mark stood up, hurt by their fear, and said, "Silence won't save her. It will only keep her trapped." He left their house with a heavy heart, feeling as though the people he counted on most had stepped back from him. On the drive home, he whispered to himself, "If they won't fight for her, then I will." The early morning sun rose over the highway, but it brought him no warmth. He thought of Grace returning to Ethan's house and felt a sharp worry settle in his chest. When he reached home, Lena met him at the door and asked softly, "Did they agree to help?" Mark shook his head and said, "No, they're too afraid." Lena guided him to the sofa and let him sit while she brought him a cup of warm tea. "Fear can make good people choose the wrong thing," she whispered gently. Mark leaned forward with his elbows on his knees and said, "But Grace needs more than silence. I need someone who understands how these powerful families operate." Lena nodded thoughtfully and replied, "There's someone who might help. My uncle Jonathan used to handle cases like this." Mark looked up sharply and asked, "Can he advise us?" Lena smiled softly and said, "He will. I'll call him now." By afternoon, Mark was sitting across from Jonathan at a quiet cafe near the edge of town. Jonathan listened calmly as Mark explained the danger Grace faced and the control Ethan held over her life. After a long pause, Jonathan said, "This isn't just a bad marriage. This is a pattern of power and fear." Mark nodded quickly and replied, "Exactly. So how do we fight someone like him?" Jonathan folded his hands and answered, "Not with anger. With evidence, planning, and patience. That is how you bring men like Ethan to justice." Jonathan pulled out a small notebook and sketched a simple plan across the page. "First," he said, "Grace must gather her medical records from every time she sought help. Those records will speak louder than emotions." Mark listened carefully, absorbing every word as if he were preparing for a mission. Jonathan continued, "Next, we must document Ethan's behavior quietly. Any threats, any patterns, anything that proves her fear is real." Lena joined them later and whispered, "And we will support Grace step by step." Mark nodded and said, "Tell me what you need. I'll do all of it." Over the next few days, Mark followed Jonathan's guidance with unwavering determination. He drove Grace to the hospital where she had been treated in the past and asked for copies of her records. Grace trembled as she held the papers, whispering, "I can't believe I lived like this for so long." Mark placed a hand on her shoulder and said, "You're not alone anymore." They also met a private investigator who agreed to quietly follow Ethan and document his movements. Grace watched nervously and whispered, I hope this isn't a mistake, and Mark replied, it's the first step toward freedom. The investigator sent the first set of reports only 3 days later. Mark sat with Lena and Grace as they reviewed photos showing Ethan meeting another woman repeatedly in cafes and restaurants. Grace covered her mouth and whispered, so he never even tried to hide it. Mark felt anger rising but kept his voice steady. This helps our case, he said firmly. Lena added softly, the truth is finally coming out, Grace. Grace nodded slowly as if accepting a reality she had tried to avoid for too long. Another breakthrough came when the investigator discovered an old case involving Ethan and a former girlfriend. Jonathan arranged a discreet meeting with the woman, and Mark drove to Los Angeles to speak with her. She hesitated at first, whispering, I don't want to remember that time. But as Mark described Grace's situation, the woman's expression changed to quiet sympathy. He hurt me too, she finally admitted. She agreed to give a statement, adding, if my voice can help someone else escape him, then I'll speak. With medical records, photos, and a witness statement, the case against Ethan grew stronger each day. Jonathan reviewed every document carefully and whispered, good. Very good. We are building something solid. Mark felt hope rising for the first time since Grace appeared at his door that night. Grace held the folder tightly against her chest and whispered, maybe I can finally breathe again. Lena gave her a soft smile and said, not maybe. You will. Mark looked at all three of them and said, this is only the beginning, but we're moving toward the ending she deserves. Jonathan advised Mark to move quietly, reminding him that powerful families often react strongly when they sense a threat. Mark nodded and said, we'll be careful. Grace's safety comes first. That evening, he visited Grace at her temporary apartment and found her sitting by the window, lost in thought. She looked up and whispered, do you really think this can end someday? Mark sat beside her and replied, yes, but we must be brave until the last step. Grace held her hands together tightly and said, then I'll try, because I don't want my child growing up in fear. Over the next few days, the evidence slowly reached trusted journalists Jonathan recommended. They didn't release everything at once, choosing instead to share small pieces that raised questions without starting a war too early. Mark watched the first articles appear online with a pounding heart as he read the quiet reports of repeated injuries and suspicious patterns. Grace sat beside him whispering, people don't know it's me, right? Lena answered, not yet, and only when you're ready. Mark pointed to the screen and said, this is the beginning. The truth is gaining light. Grace nodded, though fear still lingered in her eyes. As days passed, conversations on social media began growing louder, with people asking who the unnamed woman might be. Some viewers expressed sympathy, while others argued or doubted what they read. Grace read a few comments and whispered, people can be so cruel, even without knowing the truth. Mark gently took her phone and said, don't read those. Focus on your healing. Lena added, the world will argue, but evidence will speak for you when the time comes. Grace nodded slowly and whispered, I just want to live freely again. Mark replied, and you will soon. The first major shift happened when an advocacy organization contacted Jonathan to ask if the victim would accept support. Jonathan informed Mark, saying, this is good. When organizations speak, the public listens. Grace hesitated at first, whispering, is it safe to trust them? Mark reassured her, they're here to protect people like you. Lena added gently, let others help you carry this burden. Grace finally agreed, breathing deeply as she said, maybe I don't have to hide anymore. Jonathan nodded and replied, you don't. But every step must still be careful. Meanwhile, Ethan sensed something shifting and began calling Grace repeatedly with hostility in his voice. She refused to answer, but each call left her shaking as she whispered, he knows something is wrong. One night, Mark stayed with her and said, he won't touch you again. We won't allow it. Lena sat beside them and added softly, fear loses power when you face it together. Grace took a long breath as if gathering courage from both of them. Then I'll keep going, she whispered. I won't let him decide my life anymore. Jonathan began preparing the legal documents necessary for the next stage, marking the first direct step toward bringing Ethan to court. He met Mark in the cafe and said, we are almost ready to file. Once we do, everything becomes public. Mark nodded and replied, I understand. We've come too far to stop now. Lena joined later and asked, will this put Grace in danger again? Jonathan answered, possibly, but the more public the case is, the harder it becomes for him to act recklessly. Mark whispered, then let's move forward. The sooner we end this, the better. Grace spent those days gathering her strength, preparing mentally for the moment when she would have to speak for herself. She practiced with Lena, answering questions softly while her voice trembled at first. Lena held her hand and said, you're stronger than you think, Grace. Mark watched them and whispered, you survived years of fear. One courtroom will not break you. Grace wiped her eyes and said, I want my child to grow up seeing courage, not silence. Lena nodded proudly and replied, and that is exactly what you're showing now. When the lawsuit was officially filed, the news spread quickly across San Diego. Grace sat on the sofa staring at the printed announcement, unable to speak for several seconds. Mark placed a steady hand on her shoulder and whispered, this is it. The turning point. Lena sat beside her and added, no more hiding. No more fear. Grace whispered shakily, I'm scared, but I'm also relieved. At least now the world will hear the truth. Mark nodded and replied, and will stand with you through everything. Ethan and his family responded with sharp denial, holding a short press statement where Ethan said, these accusations are false and harmful. Grace watched it on television, feeling a cold knot form in her stomach. He looks confident, like nothing can touch him, she whispered. Mark shook his head and said, confidence doesn't mean innocence. It means he's used to winning. Lena added, this time the truth stands stronger than his money. Grace took another deep breath and whispered, then I'll face him. I won't run again. The days leading toward the first hearing felt heavy, like walking through a long tunnel with no clear end. Grace often woke up afraid, but each morning she reminded herself why she started. Mark drove her to meetings with Jonathan, where they practiced her testimony and reviewed all evidence again. Lena stayed close, comforting her whenever doubt crept in. One evening, Grace whispered, if this ends well, I'll finally get my life back. Mark smiled softly and replied, it will end well, Grace. And soon, everything will turn in your favor. The morning of the first court hearing arrived with a quiet tension that settled over the entire house. Grace paced slowly near the window, holding her hands together as she whispered, I'm not sure I can do this. Mark stood beside her and said gently, you don't have to be perfect. You just have to be honest. Lena hugged her and whispered, you've survived far worse than a courtroom. Grace nodded slowly as if borrowing strength from both of them. As they prepared to leave, Mark said softly, today is the beginning of your freedom. The courthouse was already crowded with reporters and curious onlookers by the time they arrived. Cameras clicked as Grace walked toward the entrance with her head slightly lowered, but Lena whispered, walk proudly. You're not the enemy here. Inside the courtroom, Ethan sat with his lawyers, wearing a calm expression that made Grace's heart tighten. Mark whispered, don't look at him. Look at the judge instead. Jonathan joined them, carrying a thick folder of evidence. He leaned in and said, stay steady. Truth stands strongest when spoken clearly. The early arguments centered around documents and timelines, with Ethan's lawyers insisting that the case was exaggerated. They tried to undermine the medical reports by saying, there is no direct proof my client caused these injuries. Jonathan countered calmly, there is a long pattern that cannot be ignored, Your Honor. Grace watched the exchange with trembling hands, whispering, they're trying to twist everything. Mark leaned close and said, that's what people do when they're cornered. Don't lose focus now. The judge listened attentively, studying every piece of evidence presented. Then came the moment Jonathan had prepared for. He submitted the statement from Ethan's former girlfriend. The courtroom grew silent as the words were read aloud, describing a past filled with threats and intimidation. Grace looked at the woman sitting quietly at the back of the room, offering her a grateful smile. Ethan shifted uncomfortably, losing the confident posture he carried at the start. Jonathan whispered to Mark, this cracks his image. Now the truth becomes harder to deny. Grace breathed deeply as hope flickered inside her. The judge called for a short break before Grace would be asked to speak. In the hallway, Grace leaned against the wall and whispered, my voice is shaking, what if I break down inside? Lena held her hands gently and replied, then you break down. It's not weakness. It's truth. Mark added softly, just answer from your heart. That's more powerful than anything he can say. Grace closed her eyes and whispered, for my child. I'll do it. Jonathan nodded approvingly and said, that's the strength the court needs to hear. When Grace finally took the stand, her voice trembled at first, but slowly grew steady. She described her life inside Ethan's home, the control, the fear, and the silence she felt forced to maintain. I forgot who I was, she said softly. I lived each day wondering how to avoid conflict instead of how to live freely. Ethan's lawyers tried to interrupt, but the judge raised a hand for silence. Lena whispered from her seat, she's doing it, she's really doing it. Mark felt tears form in his eyes as he watched Grace speak her truth. Jonathan then displayed key evidence that matched Grace's testimony, dates, records, and photos that aligned perfectly with her words. The judge reviewed everything with a thoughtful expression, occasionally nodding. Ethan's lawyers argued again, but their voices lacked the confidence they had earlier. Ethan sat stiffly, his eyes fixed on the table instead of on Grace. This is the moment, Jonathan whispered. Mark clasped his hands together as if praying for a final strike of justice. Grace sat down again, exhausted but relieved. After a brief deliberation, the judge returned with a firm expression, signaling that the decision had been made. Everyone rose as the courtroom fell silent. The judge spoke clearly, stating that the evidence supported Grace's claims and that a pattern of harm had been established. He granted Grace a protective order, restricted Ethan's contact, and emphasized the court's duty to protect her and her child. Grace placed a hand over her mouth as tears filled her eyes. Mark whispered, "You won, Grace. You really won." The aftermath felt like stepping into sunlight after years of being trapped underground. Grace filed for divorce immediately with Jonathan's help, and the process moved quickly now that the truth was recognized. She gained custody of her child and moved into a peaceful home where laughter returned slowly. Mark visited often, bringing groceries or simply sitting to talk while the child played in the yard. Lena helped Grace find a stable job and encouraged her to join a support group for women rebuilding their lives. Grace often whispered, "I never thought freedom would feel this warm." One evening, Mark sat on a quiet beach, watching the waves roll across the sand as the sky glowed gold. He thought about the night Grace had knocked on his door at 2 a.m. trembling and afraid. Now she lived with hope, courage, and peace, no longer hiding from fear. Lena walked over and sat beside him, whispering, "You changed her life, Mark." He shook his head softly and replied, "No, she changed it when she chose to speak." As the sun dipped below the horizon, he felt a deep sense of closure, knowing the silence had finally broken and the truth had won. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and tell me your thoughts in the comments below. I love reading your reactions.